The master's coat, a fine piece of dark wool, was found draped neatly across the chapel altar as if it were a holy shroud. The master himself, Alistair Finch, was gone. The slave, Elias Turner, had vanished into the same suffocating South Carolina night. But what the official reports never captured, what the whispers on the backroads swore to, was the sight of two figures walking away together, one holding a lantern against the darkness, the other bare-shouldered beneath the moonlight. What secret bound a master and his slave in a desperate flight for freedom? What sin were they running from, or to? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of the disappearance began, as all Sundays did in the year of our Lord 1847, with the ringing of a bell. It was a sound that promised salvation but delivered only servitude. Inside the small plantation chapel, the air was a physical weight, a thick, humid blanket woven from the smells of old pine, wilting magnolias, and the cloying sweetness of cheap perfume worn by the Finch family. Sunlight, heavy and yellow, forced its way through the tall, narrow windows, illuminating a galaxy of dust motes that danced in the oppressive stillness. In the back pew, where the heat was most concentrated and the word of God was most diluted, sat Elias Turner. His posture was a study in rigid control, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the frayed collar of the man in front of him. But inside, his mind was a tempest. It was a storm of silent defiance and desperate prayer, a stark, churning contrast to the preacher's droning sermon on the virtues of obedience. For it is the meek who shall inherit the earth, the preacher intoned, his voice a monotonous buzz that seemed to be soaked up by the thick, damp wood of the walls. Elias's eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing. He saw the sweat that beaded on the preacher's brow and trickled down his fleshy jowls, the strained theatrical piety on the faces of the Finch family in the front pew, the way Mrs. Finch fanned herself with a paper fan, her movements agitated and sharp. He saw it all, a tableau of gilded hypocrisy set against a backdrop of genuine suffering. In that front pew, Master Alistair Finch looked like a ghost haunting his own life. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, a washed-out blue, were unfocused, staring at a point somewhere beyond the altar and the preacher. He fidgeted with the collar of his expensive wool coat, the very same coat that would, in a matter of hours, become the central relic of a local legend. The fabric was dark and heavy, far too warm for the season, a trapping of a status he wore like a lead weight. His fingers plucked at the material, a nervous, repetitive gesture that betrayed a mind far from the sermon's placid reassurances. For a fleeting second, his gaze lifted, drifting over the heads of his family and the few white congregants, and found Elias in the back. It was a glance that held a world of meaning no one else in the stifling chapel could possibly decipher. A silent, desperate exchange that was both a question and a command. Elias met his master's eyes for only a moment, his own expression an unreadable mask of stoicism, before looking away. The connection was severed, but the current of unspoken understanding lingered in the thick air between them, a dangerous secret in a room built for public confession. The preacher's voice rose, reaching a crescendo of manufactured passion. But for Elias and Alistair, the sermon had ended the moment their eyes met. The real service, the one that would demand a true and terrible sacrifice, was yet to begin. Later that afternoon, the source of Alistair Finch's desperation festered in the quiet solitude of his private study. It was a room that should have been a sanctuary of intellect and power, lined with leather-bound books on philosophy, history, and law, inherited from a father who had valued the appearance of erudition. But the room was dominated by a large mahogany desk, its polished surface buried under a chaotic landscape of ledgers and account books. Here, the true story of the Finch plantation was written not in prose, but in columns of damning red ink. Alistair sat hunched over the desk, the fine wool coat now slung carelessly over the back of his chair. As he stared at the figures, they were a relentless tide of debt, a mountain of financial ruin he had inherited along with the land, the house, and the people who worked it. His father had been a man of grand appetites and poor foresight, and Alistair was now drowning in the consequences. He picked up a letter that had arrived by courier from Charleston 2 days prior. The stationery was thick and expensive, the penmanship an elegant, flowing script, but the words were as cold and hard as granite. It was from Mr. Vance, his fiancée's father, a merchant of immense wealth and influence. The letter spoke of the impending marriage, not with joy or paternal affection, but as a clinical merger of assets. It outlined, in excruciating detail, the strict financial conditions of the union, the schedules of payment for Alistair's debts that would be assumed by the Vance family, the collateral represented by the plantation's land, and implicitly, its human property. Alistair felt a wave of nausea. He was not a groom preparing for a life of partnership. He was a failing asset being acquired, a piece of collateral in a transaction designed to expand the Vance family's portfolio. He was being bought and sold as surely as any man, woman, or child on his own property rolls. With a strangled cry of rage and self-loathing, he crumpled the letter in his fist, the thick paper crackling in the silent room. He lurched to his feet and strode to the tall window, his hands braced against the frame, his knuckles white. He felt trapped, the walls of the study closing in on him, the weight of his father's failures and his fiancée's expectations pressing down until he could barely breathe. His gaze fell upon the world outside, a world he owned but could not control. And then he saw him, Elias. He was by the woodpile near the smokehouse, splitting logs for the kitchen fires. The axe rose and fell with a powerful, rhythmic grace, each swing a model of efficiency and strength. Elias's shirt was off in the oppressive heat, his back a canvas of corded muscle that gleamed with sweat under the afternoon sunday. There was a quiet dignity in his labor, a focused intensity that seemed to block out the entire world. He was not frantic or desperate, he was simply present, his existence defined by the physical reality of the task at hand. Alistair watched him, a strange mix of admiration and envy twisting in his gut. He saw in Elias a strength he himself had never known, a quiet self-possession that stood in stark, mocking contrast to his own frantic, suffocating desperation. And in that moment, looking out from his gilded cage at the man in chains, the seed of a desperate, unthinkable, and utterly mad plan was planted. It was a plan born of envy, a plan that saw in the slave's quiet strength the only possible key to his own salvation. The shadow of the overseer Jedediah fell long and ugly across the plantation grounds. He was a man carved from the same gnarled, bitter wood as the whips he carried, his presence a constant, low-grade poison in the air. He watched Elias from the porch of the main house. His eyes narrowed with a suspicion that was as natural to him as breathing. Jedediah resented Elias. He resented his intelligence, the way he carried himself with a quiet reserve that the overseer mistook for insolence. He resented the fact that Elias could read and write, a skill taught to him in secret by Alistair's mother years ago, a fact that Jedediah knew and despised. Most of all, he resented any sign of favor shown to Elias by the master. And lately, the master's behavior had been very strange indeed. Alistair had been assigning Elias unusual tasks, pulling him from the field crews for work that made no sense. Last week, it was clearing a disused path at the far edge of the property, a path that led only to the swamp. This week, it was repairing the chapel altar, a job for a carpenter, not a field hand. Jedediah had seen Elias coming and going from the small, lonely building, carrying tools. His face set in that infuriatingly calm expression. The overseer's mind, a place of crude and violent certainties, could not make sense of it, and what he could not understand, he hated. He pushed himself off the porch railing and ambled towards the woodpile, his boots kicking up dust. Elias did not stop his work, the rhythmic thud of the axe continuing as Jedediah approached. The overseer stopped a few feet away, close enough for his sour smell of sweat and cheap tobacco to reach Elias. "The master seems to have taken a shine to you, boy," Jedediah said, his voice a low, gravelly threat. The axe stopped mid-swing. Elias slowly lowered it, resting the head on the chopping block. He turned his head just enough to acknowledge the overseer's presence, his eyes calm. "Just doing the work I'm given," Elias replied, his voice even. Jedediah's lip curled into a sneer. He hated that calm. He wanted to see fear, to see the flinch and the downcast eyes that confirmed his power. "Repairing a chapel altar," Jedediah mused, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice near Elias's bare feet. "Seems like holy work for a field hand. You find in religion, Elias, or is the master finding something else in you?" The insinuation hung in the air, thick and venomous. Elias said nothing. He simply stood there, his silence a wall that Jedediah could not breach. It was a silence more powerful than any shouted retort, a quiet refusal to be drawn into the overseer's filthy games. The silence infuriated Jedediah more than any curse could have. "You just remember who holds the whip in this place," he snarled, his hand instinctively moving to the coiled leather at his belt. "The master might be lost in his books and his debts, but I see everything. You remember that." Elias remained silent, his gaze unwavering. After a long, tense moment, Jedediah grunted, a sound of frustrated rage, and turned on his heel, stalking back towards the main house. Elias watched him go, his expression unchanged, but as he lifted the axe again, the first swing came down with a force that split the thick log in two with a single clean crack, a release of the cold fury that he had so carefully kept hidden behind his wall of silence. The plan was a fragile, terrifying thing, and Jedediah was a blunt instrument capable of smashing it to pieces before it had even begun. The last of the congregation had dispersed, their footsteps fading into the humid twilight, leaving behind a silence in the chapel that was heavier than the earlier sermon. As dusk bled through the tall windows, staining the air with hues of bruised purple and soft gray, Elias remained, He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, wiping down the tools he had used on the altar, his movements a plausible excuse for his lingering presence. The scent of lemon oil from his cloth mingled with the lingering smells of pine and old hymnals. Each rasp of the cloth against steel, each soft thud of a tool being placed in its canvas roll, was a small, sharp sound in the profound quiet. The world outside was shifting from day to night, and with it, the world of Elias Turner was about to be irrevocably remade. He felt the change not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a thrumming deep in his chest, a heightened awareness of the shadows deepening in the corners of the small building. A floorboard creaked near the main entrance. Elias didn't flinch, didn't turn his head. He had been expecting it. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure slip inside, moving with the furtive, nervous energy of a thief. It was Alistair Finch, his pale face a ghostly mask in the dimming light. He closed the heavy door with a quiet click that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the stillness. The air grew thick with unspoken words, with the shared terror and desperate hope of their impossible pact. Alistair moved down the central aisle, his expensive leather shoes making almost no sound on the worn wooden floor. He stopped a few feet from the altar, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked at Elias, his eyes wide with a fear so naked it was almost pitiable. For a moment, they were just two men, stripped of their titles, standing on the precipice of a shared abyss. Alistair broke the silence, his voice a dry whisper that barely carried. "The North Star is clear tonight, Elias." It was the final confirmation, the last chance to turn back from the edge. Elias continued his work, running a soft cloth over the smooth, cool head of a chisel, his knuckles brushing against the wood of the altar he had supposedly been repairing. He did not look at his master, a lifetime of ingrained behavior impossible to shed in a single moment. Yet his reply was steady, a low murmur that held the certainty Alistair so desperately lacked. "The path is old," Elias said, his voice resonating with a knowledge born of generations of whispered secrets and desperate flights. "The water will hide the scent from the dogs." The words were practical, a statement of fact, but they carried the weight of their entire plan. They spoke of swamps and darkness, of hounds and hunters, of a journey into a world that would try to swallow them whole. Alistair took another step forward, his hand trembling slightly as he reached inside his waistcoat. He pulled out two objects. One was a small, heavy leather pouch that gave a soft, metallic clink. The other was a folded piece of oilskin, dark and weathered. He pressed them into Elias's free hand. The leather of the pouch was surprisingly soft, the weight of the coins inside a solid, terrifying reality. The oilskin was cool and smooth. "This won't make it easy," Alistair whispered, his voice cracking with the strain, "but it will make it possible. For both of us." Elias's fingers closed around the pouch and the map, his grip tight. He said nothing, but his knuckles went white. This was it, the payment and the path, the price of one man's life and the map to another's. He finally lifted his head, and for a second, his eyes met Alistair's in that shared gaze. The last vestiges of the master and slave relationship dissolved into the twilight, replaced by the stark, terrifying equality of two conspirators bound by a shared fate. Elias gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and then slipped the pouch and the map into the deep pocket of his worn trousers. The pact was sealed. Alistair turned away from Elias and faced the altar, the simple wooden structure at the heart of the chapel. He stood before it as if it were a judge, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. The last rays of sunlight from the highest window fell upon him, a final, weak spotlight on the stage of his former life. He looked down at himself, at the fine wool coat that was a symbol of everything he was and everything he was leaving behind. It was the uniform of his class, the armor of his privilege, the very fabric of his identity as Master Finch. It was also his prison, a garment woven from threads of debt, expectation, and a future he loathed more than death itself. With movements that were slow and strangely deliberate, he began to unbutton the coat. One by one, the polished buttons slipped free from their holes. The gesture was methodical, almost reverent, like a priest disrobing after a long and difficult service. He shrugged his shoulders, and the heavy coat slid from his frame. He held it in his hands for a long moment. The dark wool pooled in his arms. His expression was a complex tapestry of regret and profound relief. He was letting go of the only life he had ever known, a life of comfort and authority. But it was a life that had been slowly strangling him. He looked at the coat, at the fine stitching, the silk lining, the subtle scent of tobacco and old paper that clung to it. It was the skin he was about to shed. With a deep, shuddering breath, he carefully folded the garment. He smoothed the lapels, straightened the collar, his hands moving with a tenderness that was almost heartbreaking. It was not an act of discarding something worthless, but of laying a part of himself to rest. He then leaned forward and draped the folded coat neatly across the center of the wooden altar. It lay there in the gloom, a dark funereal offering upon the sacred table. The symbolic weight of the act filled the small chapel, a silent scream of surrender and defiance. Alistair stepped back, his voice barely audible, a ghost of a sound in the empty room. "They will find this," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the coat. "They will think what they will think." A small, bitter smile touched his lips. Let the name Finch be a ghost. He was now in a simple, sweat-stained linen shirt, his arms bare, his frame looking slighter, more vulnerable than Elias had ever seen it. He was no longer Alistair Finch, master of the plantation. He was a nameless, stripped-down man, a fugitive from his own life, ready to step into the terrifying anonymity of the night. They moved towards a small, seldom-used door behind the chancel, a door that led directly out into the overgrown grass behind the chapel, away from the main house and the watchful eyes of the quarters. Alistair pushed the door open a crack, and the cool night air, alive with the chirping of crickets and the distant croak of frogs, rushed in to meet them. It was the scent of their new world, a world of shadows and uncertainty. As Alistair prepared to step across the threshold, Elias paused. His body froze, his hand hovering just above the rough wood of the door frame. He turned his head, his gaze drawn irresistibly towards the chapel window, through the wavy, imperfect glass, across the manicured lawn that he himself had cut just 2 days before. He could see the distant, humble lights of the slave quarters. They were small, flickering points of warmth in the vast, encroaching darkness. One of those lights was his. One of those lights was Sarah. In the silent, cavernous space of his mind, He saw her face as clearly as if she were standing before him. He saw the gentle curve of her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed, the quiet strength in her hands as she mended his torn shirt by the light of a single candle. He could almost feel the warmth of her hand in his, a silent comfort in the shared darkness of their small cabin after a day of brutal labor. The plan, their desperate, mad plan, had demanded a cruelty he was only now beginning to comprehend. He had to tell her nothing. He had to wake up this morning, eat the small piece of cornbread she had saved for him, and walk away without a word of his true intentions. To share the secret would have been to place a noose around her neck. When they discovered him gone, Jedediah's rage would be a firestorm, and anyone suspected of aiding him would be consumed by it. Her only safety lay in her genuine ignorance, in the real, unfeigned shock and grief she would feel when his absence was known. He had protected her by abandoning her, a paradox so cruel it felt like a physical blade twisting in his gut. The silence of his departure was a betrayal, a necessary sin that would haunt him for the rest of his days. A single hot tear escaped his eye, cutting a clean, sharp path through the grime and sweat on his cheek. It was a tear for the woman he loved, for the life they had carved out together in the heart of an impossible world, for the unseen goodbye that was a scream of anguish in the silence of his soul. He had made his choice. The cost was immeasurable, a debt he could never repay, but the path was set. With a final, ragged breath, he tore his gaze away from the window and the light that marked his entire world. He turned his back on his wife, on his past, on the man he had been. His face, when he turned towards the open door, was set like stone, a mask of grim and unyielding resolve. He had paid the price. Now he would claim what he had bought. He looked at Alistair, who was waiting for him, a pale specter at the edge of the abyss. Elias gave another single, sharp nod. He stepped forward, following the man who was once his master out of the chapel and into the descending, all-consuming blackness of the South Carolina night. The small door swung shut behind them, its quiet click the final definitive sound of a world left behind forever. The world they stepped into was not a world of silent, peaceful darkness. It was a world of overwhelming sound, a chaotic, living symphony that rose up from the earth and fell from the sky. The moment the chapel door clicked shut, they were plunged into a labyrinth of cypress trees and hanging moss, a place that felt more ancient and alive than anything Alistair Finch had ever known. The air, thick and wet, carried the cloying, sweet smell of decay and damp earth, a primal perfume that seemed to coat the back of his throat. A cacophony of insects and frogs erupted around them, a relentless, pulsating wall of sound that vibrated in his bones. It was the sound of a world indifferent to his existence, a world that would swallow him without a trace. Alistair, holding the single, bobbing lantern, was a beacon of terror in the oppressive blackness. The small circle of light it cast seemed only to emphasize the infinite, impenetrable darkness that pressed in from all sides, turning the gnarled cypress knees into grasping claws and the trailing Spanish moss into skeletal fingers. His fine leather shoes, so suited to the polished floors of his home, were instantly useless. They slipped on unseen roots and sank into the sucking, greedy mud, making a foul, slurping sound with every terrified step. He stumbled constantly, his arms flailing for balance, the lantern swinging wildly, casting frantic, dancing shadows that played tricks on his already frayed nerves. He was a creature of drawing rooms and manicured lawns, and here, in the raw, untamed heart of the swamp, he was less than a child. He was a liability. Elias, in stark contrast, moved through the suffocating darkness as if he were born to it. He was barefoot, his feet finding purchase on the treacherous ground with a quiet confidence. He moved with a fluid, steady grace, his shoulders, bare to the humid night air, seeming to absorb the moonlight and the shadows in equal measure. He was not merely walking. He was reading the world around him, his head tilted, listening to the sounds of the night, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the lantern's weak glow, his body navigating the labyrinthine paths with an instinct that felt like a form of magic. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. On the plantation, Alistair's word was law, his comfort paramount. Here, Alistair was a blind, deaf, and clumsy burden, utterly dependent on the man he had once owned. Every few moments, Alistair's panicked gaze would dart to Elias, seeking reassurance, direction, anything. Elias offered none. He simply moved forward, his silence a steady, implacable force, and Alistair, the former master, had no choice but to follow the quiet, determined footsteps of his former slave into the terrifying, unknown heart of the cypress maze. They had been walking for what felt like an eternity, a timeless stretch of mud, darkness, and fear, when a new sound cut through the swamp's chaotic chorus. It was faint at first, a distant, mournful cry that Alistair almost dismissed as another strange night bird. But then it came again, closer this time, a deep, resonant baying that was utterly unmistakable. It was a sound that struck a chord of primal terror in Alistair's heart, a sound from his deepest nightmares. Hounds. Elias stopped dead, his body going rigid. The sound had not startled him, but it had focused him, every muscle tensed and ready. In the sudden stillness, the baying of the dogs grew louder, more distinct, a relentless hunting cry that promised violence and capture. A cold dread, sharper and more profound than anything he had felt before, seized Alistair. It couldn't be, not so soon. He had imagined a formal posse, a sheriff gathering men in the morning light. He had not counted on this. He had not counted on the pure, undiluted rage of Jedediah. The overseer, in his fury and burning suspicion, had not waited for the law. He had gathered his own men, his own dogs, and had come for them himself. Panic, pure and blinding, erupted in Alistair's chest. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. He was ready to run, to crash blindly through the undergrowth in any direction, to do anything to escape the sound of those approaching hounds. He took a stumbling step, a strangled sob escaping his lips. But before he could take a second, a hand clamped down on his arm. The grip was like iron, a shocking, painful force that stopped him cold. It was Elias. In the flickering lantern light, Elias's face was a mask of grim intensity, his eyes burning with a fire that seemed to push back the darkness. "Hush," he commanded, his voice a low, sharp hiss that cut through Alistair's panic like a knife. The command was not a request. It was an order, delivered with an authority Alistair had never heard from him before. Elias tugged him forward, pulling him off the barely visible path and towards a deeper darkness to their left. Alistair stumbled after him, his mind reeling. They crashed through a thicket of ferns and saw palmetto, the sharp fronds scratching at their faces and arms. The smell hit them before they saw it. A foul, stagnant stench of rot and decay. Before them lay a deep, slow-moving creek, its water as black and opaque as ink. "The water," Elias said, his voice urgent, leaving no room for argument. "It's our only chance." Without waiting for a reply, he slid down the muddy bank, the foul water closing around his legs with a sickening gulp. He turned and looked up at Alistair, his expression demanding obedience. For a terrifying second, Alistair hesitated, his entire being recoiling from the filthy, stinking water. But the baying of the hounds was closer now, a frantic, bloodthirsty chorus, punctuated by the angry shouts of men. Jedediah's voice, raw and furious, carried clearly through the night. With another sob, Alistair let the lantern fall, its light extinguished with a hiss as it hit the water, plunging them into near-total blackness. He slid down the bank, the cold, murky water a profound shock to his system. It soaked through his linen shirt instantly, and the soft, deep mud of the creek bed sucked at his ankles, trying to pull him down. Elias grabbed his shirt and pulled him deeper, towards a thick overhang of the creek bank, where tangled roots and earth created a small, dark cavern. "Under here," Elias whispered, pushing him down. "Keep your head low, only your nose and eyes above the surface." They submerged themselves in the cold, foul water, pressing their backs against the muddy bank, the tangled roots just inches above their heads. The sounds of the posse were deafeningly loud now, crashing through the undergrowth right where they had been standing moments before. The frantic, excited baying of the dogs was right at the water's edge, so close Alistair could hear their panting, their claws scrabbling at the dirt of the bank just above their heads. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he was sure they could hear it. He could see the flickering, distorted light of torches through the water, could hear Jedediah's curses, a stream of venomous rage. They were terrifyingly close, a thin sheet of black water and a few inches of earth, the only thing separating them from certain death. Alistair squeezed his eyes shut, the stench of the creek filling his nostrils, the cold seeping deep into his bones, and prayed to a God he was no longer sure he believed in. The dogs, frantic with the scent, ran up and down the creek bank, whining and barking in confusion. The trail ended here, at this foul, black water, and their canine minds could not follow it further. "Damn it all to hell," Jedediah's voice roared, a sound of pure frustration that echoed over the water. They went in. They must have. Alistair's heart stopped. He could hear the men moving along the bank, their torchlight playing over the surface of the water. A beam of light passed directly over their hiding spot, and for a heart-stopping moment, Alistair was sure he had been seen. But the light moved on. They could be anywhere, another man's voice said. Could have crossed and be a mile away by now. Or they could have drowned. "This swamp'll swallow a man whole," Jedediah cursed again, a long, vile string of profanities. There was a moment of tense silence, broken only by the whining of the dogs and the chirping of the frogs, who had resumed their chorus as if nothing had happened. "Spread out," Jedediah finally snarled. "Check the banks downstream. If they're alive, they'll have to come out sometime. I want that slave, and I want what he stole from the master." The sounds of the posse slowly began to fade, the crashing and shouting receding back into the swamp's constant hum. The torchlights vanished, and the oppressive darkness returned. Now, a welcome sanctuary, Elias and Alistair remained submerged, motionless, shivering in the cold water long after the last sounds of the hunters had disappeared. The adrenaline that had coursed through Alistair's veins was replaced by a deep, bone-aching chill. His body trembled uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so loudly it seemed to fill the silence. The fear remained, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of his stomach, but it was now mingled with the sheer physical misery of his situation. Finally, Elias moved, slowly raising his head from the water. He listened intently for a long moment before letting out a slow, quiet breath. He put a hand on Alistair's shoulder, a silent signal that it was safe. They crawled out from under the overhang, their bodies slick with mud and slime, the stench of the creek clinging to them like a second skin. They collapsed on the muddy bank, shivering violently, their clothes dripping, their bodies trembling with cold and exhaustion. Alistair curled into a ball, wrapping his arms around himself, unable to stop the violent tremors that shook his frame. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. He was a fugitive, hunted in the dark by a man who would see him hang, stripped of his name, his wealth, and his dignity, covered in filth and shivering in a swamp. Despair, absolute and profound, washed over him. "He'll find us," Alistair whispered, his voice a hoarse, chattering wreck. "God help me. Jedediah will find us and hang us both from the same tree." He buried his face in his muddy arms, his shoulders shaking with silent, hopeless sobs. Elias sat beside him, a still, dark shape in the night. He was shivering too, but his posture was different. It was the shivering of a body enduring the cold, not the trembling of a spirit broken by fear. He looked out over the black, placid water of the creek, his gaze calm and steady. He let Alistair's despair hang in the air for a long moment, a tangible thing between them. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but as solid as a rock in the darkness, a stark contrast to Alistair's trembling whisper. "The water is older than he is," Elias said, his words cutting through the night. "The night is deeper than his hate." He turned his head, his eyes finding Alistair's in the gloom. "Be still," he said, his voice holding not comfort, but a profound, unshakable certainty. "We wait." And in that moment, a fragile, unspoken trust began to form, a bond born not of friendship or affection, but of shared, desperate necessity. A trust in the quiet, competent man who seemed to understand the ancient rhythms of the night and the water, the only allies they had left in the world. The Finch plantation, which had for generations run on a quiet, brutal efficiency, was now in a state of controlled chaos. The news of the master's disappearance and the slave's flight had spread like a fever, creating a nervous energy that crackled beneath the veneer of morning chores. It was into this simmering pot of fear and speculation that a fine carriage, pulled by two perfectly matched black horses, arrived in a cloud of dust and authority. The carriage door was opened by a liveried footman, and from it emerged Eleonora Vance and her father. Eleonora was a vision of cool, crisp anger. Her traveling dress was immaculate, her posture rigid, and her face, framed by a severe bonnet, was a mask of cold fury. She was not a grieving bride. She was an investor whose primary asset had vanished. Her father, A stout man with a face like a clenched fist followed her out, his eyes sweeping over the plantation with the cold, appraising gaze of a man counting his money. The county sheriff, a weary man named Beaufort, whose uniform was already dark with sweat, met them at the steps of the main house. He had been dealing with Jedediah's drunken rage and the panicked whispers of the house staff all morning, and the arrival of the Vances was a complication he did not need. He showed them into Alistair's study, where the dark wool coat was laid out on the mahogany desk, like a body awaiting autopsy. Eleonora approached it, her movements sharp and precise. She did not touch it. Her eyes, the color of ice, scanned the garment with a critical, assessing stare, noting the quality of the fabric and the lack of any visible damage. There was no sentiment in her gaze, only calculation. "There is no blood," she stated, her voice as sharp and clear as breaking glass. It was not a question. "No, ma'am." Sheriff Beaufort confirmed, shifting his weight. "No sign of a struggle. Just this, left on the chapel altar." Eleonora's lip curled in a faint sneer of disgust, not for the potential violence, but for the sheer theatricality of it all. "This is an outrage," she said, turning her gaze from the coat to the sheriff, and he felt the full force of her contempt. Alistair was weak, but he was not a fool. The slave did this. He took whatever money and valuables were in the house and he killed him. She spoke of her fiancé in the past tense without a flicker of emotion. "Find him," she commanded, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Or find what's left of him. My father's interests in this matter are substantial, and they will be protected." Her father grunted in agreement, his hand resting on his gold-headed cane. "And find the slave," Eleonora added, her eyes narrowing. "He will tell us what happened before he hangs. I want to know where the money went." Her focus was clear. It was on assets and answers, not a lost love. The human cost was merely an inconvenient detail in a messy financial ledger. Miles away, at a dusty crossroads where the main road intersected with an old, disused logging trace, Sheriff Beaufort had set up a makeshift checkpoint. He questioned travelers, his patience worn thin by the heat and the endless stream of useless information. He was looking for a man on the run, a desperate slave who had likely killed his master. A simple, brutal story he could understand. He was not prepared for the tale told by a traveling merchant, a lanky man named Silas with a cart full of clanging pots and pans. Silas was nervous under the sheriff's tired, accusatory gaze, twisting the brim of his sweat-stained hat in his hands. "Seen anything unusual last night, or this morning?" Beaufort asked, the question already wrote on his tongue. Silas hesitated, his brow furrowed in thought. "Well, Sheriff," he began, his voice slow and deliberate. "It was the strangest thing. I was making camp for the night, just off the old logging road, a few miles from here. It was well past midnight. The moon was high." He paused, as if trying to make sure the image was clear in his own mind before sharing it. "I saw two men walking, just walking along the road heading north." Beaufort sighed. "Was one of them a colored man?" "Oh, yes, sir. One of them was," Silas said, nodding eagerly. "A strong-looking colored man, he was. And here's the strange part. He wasn't wearing a shirt. His shoulders were bare to the moonlight. But he wasn't bound. He wasn't running. He was just walking, steady as you please. The sheriff's interest peaked slightly. And the other man? He was a tall fellow, Silas recounted, his eyes distant with the memory, dressed in a gentleman's shirt, all white in the moonlight, but he looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face was pale, and he was holding a lantern, holding it so tight his knuckles were white, even though the moon was bright enough to see by. He was stumbling a bit, like he wasn't used to the road. The sheriff frowned, the story not fitting the neat narrative in his head. So, the white man was holding the lantern, and the colored man was walking beside him? Right beside him, Silas confirmed, his voice filled with a simple, honest wonder. That's what was so strange about it, Sheriff. They didn't look like a patrol, and they sure didn't look like a runaway and his captor. The colored man, he was the one who seemed to know the way. The gentleman, he just followed. They just walked together. Didn't seem right, somehow, but I saw it with my own 2 eyes. Beaufort stared at the merchant for a long moment, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. The story was confusing, unsettling. It complicated things. A trick of the moonlight, the sheriff said gruffly, dismissing the account. You were tired. Now, move along. Silas, looking slightly crestfallen, nodded and urged his mule forward, the pots and pans rattling as the cart moved on. But the story did not move on. A farmer waiting to be questioned had overheard, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. The sheriff had dismissed it as nonsense. But the tale of the 2 walkers, the ghost of a gentleman and his bare-shouldered guide, had been set loose upon the backroads. It was the birth of a legend, a story that would be whispered in taverns and slave quarters, a myth that would grow and change with each telling, soon to become far more real to the people of South Carolina than the inconvenient truth. The shared danger and the primal fear of the hunt had burned away the last vestiges of their old lives, leaving behind only the raw, elemental truth of their situation. They were 2 men, exhausted, filthy, and huddled together for warmth against the encroaching chill of the night. They had found a temporary sanctuary in a shallow cave, a rocky outcrop hidden by a thicket of rhododendron, where they had dared to build a small, smokeless fire from dry twigs. The tiny flames cast a flickering, intimate light on their faces, creating a small pocket of warmth and humanity in the vast, indifferent wilderness. For hours, they had sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant chorus of the swamp. The rigid barriers of master and slave, so insurmountable on the plantation, had crumbled into dust, leaving an awkward, uncertain space between them. It was Alistair who finally broke the silence, his voice raspy and low. He stared into the hypnotic dance of the flames, his face a mask of profound weariness. She would have owned me, Elias, he said, the words coming out in a ragged whisper. He didn't need to say who he meant. My father left nothing but debts. Grand, towering mountains of debt. The land, the house, the people, all of it was mortgaged to the hilt. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. The marriage was a business transaction. Her father was buying the Finch name and what was left of the estate, and I was part of the acquisition. He let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. I read the letters from her father's lawyers. I was a piece of property being traded to settle a debt, Elias. No different from... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. He couldn't finish the sentence. couldn't make the final, terrible comparison. But he didn't have to. The unspoken words hung in the air between them, a shocking, profound admission that changed everything. He finally looked at Elias, his eyes filled with a self-loathing so deep it was bottomless. I was a coward. I was suffocating. And I saw you, that day by the woodpile, and I saw a strength I didn't have. I thought, if I could just borrow some of it, if I could just use it to get away, I could be free. Elias listened, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He had known, of course, that Master Alistair was in some kind of trouble, but he had never imagined the depth of this despair. This strange, mirrored servitude. Alistair's confession, in its raw and pathetic honesty, had offered not an excuse, but an explanation that was profoundly, disturbingly human. The silence stretched on, and Alistair seemed to shrink into himself, as if ashamed of his naked vulnerability. Elias turned a piece of wood over in his hands, his long fingers tracing the grain. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, devoid of judgment or pity. "My father was a free man," he said, his gaze fixed on the wood in his hands. The words fell into the silence with the weight of stones. Alistair looked up, startled. He was an herbalist, a healer. He knew the woods, the swamps, knew every root, every leaf, taught me how to read the stars, how to listen to the water. A faint, sad smile touched Elias's lips for a fleeting moment. He was walking to visit my mother's sister, near the Santee River. He was taken by patrollers. They said his papers were forgeries. They tore them up in front of him. Elias's voice remained steady, a monotone recitation of a story learned by heart. He was sold at an auction in Charleston. I was a boy. I never saw him again. The man who bought him changed his name, sent him to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. We heard he died of a fever within the year. He placed the piece of wood carefully into the fire, and they both watched as the flames licked at it, slowly consuming it. They stole his life, his name, his knowledge. They tried to make him into a piece of property. Elias finally lifted his head and looked at Alistair, his eyes dark pools of ancient grief. "We are all of us trapped, Mr. Finch," he said, using the name for the first time since the chapel, not as a title of deference, but as a simple acknowledgement of the man before him, just in different cages. In that moment, by the light of a small hidden fire, a profound and somber understanding was forged between them. It was not friendship. The chasm of their pasts was too wide and too deep for that. It was a fragile, human connection, a shared recognition of loss, of fathers stolen by a cruel system, of futures denied by a fate they did not choose. They were two ghosts, haunted by the lives they were supposed to live, bound together on a desperate journey into the unknown. The fragile warmth of their shared confessions by the fire could not hold back the harsh reality of the days that followed. The journey became a grueling, monotonous rhythm of walking, hiding, and enduring. The swamp gave way to dense pine forests and rolling hills, a landscape that was less treacherous but no less unforgiving. Days were spent in hiding, huddled in thickets or shallow ravines, listening for any sound that was not the wind in the trees. Nights were for movement. Stumbling march under the cold, impartial gaze of the moon and stars. The small pouch of coins Alistair had provided was nearly useless, as they dared not approach any town or farmstead. They survived on what Elias could forage, a meager diet of bitter roots, sour berries, and the occasional small bird or squirrel he managed to trap. The constant exposure, the gnawing hunger, and the ever-present fear began to take their toll, chipping away at their reserves of strength. It was Alistair who broke first. His body, unaccustomed to such hardship, simply gave out. One evening, as they prepared to set out for another night's walk, he stumbled and fell. And this time, he could not get back up. He was burning with fever, his skin hot and dry to the touch, his eyes glassy and unfocused. By the time Elias had half dragged, half carried him to a damp, hidden hollow, sheltered by a curtain of weeping willow, Alistair was lost to delirium. He thrashed in a miserable bed of leaves, his body racked with violent shivers despite the heat radiating from his skin. He muttered a constant, nonsensical stream of words, fragments of his old life, bubbling up from the depths of his fevered mind. He spoke of his father, of columns of red ink, of the cold weight of his fiancée's expectations. The ledgers, they won't balance, he moaned, his hands clutching at the empty air. Collateral, just a piece of collateral. At one point, he sat bolt upright, his eyes wide with a phantom terror, and pointed a trembling finger into the darkness. "The coat," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "On the altar. They'll know I'm a ghost." Elias watched him, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He felt a cold knot of something that might have been pity, or perhaps just a weary resignation. This was the man who had held the power of life and death over him, now as helpless as a newborn. Instead of abandoning him to the fever that would surely claim him by morning, Elias took on the role of caretaker. The knowledge his father had passed down, the whispered lessons on roots and leaves, which had once been a secret comfort, now became a tool for survival. He left Alistair's side and moved through the woods with a quiet purpose, his eyes scanning the forest floor. He found the bitter root of a feverfew plant, its leaves lacy and delicate. He dug up the thick, gnarled root of a wild ginger. He stripped the bark from a willow branch, knowing the properties that soothed pain and cooled the blood. Back in the hollow, he crushed the roots and bark between two stones, mixing them with a little water from his canteen to form a thick, dark paste. He forced the bitter medicine past Alistair's clenched teeth, ignoring his weak struggles. He bathed Alistair's face and neck with cool water from a nearby stream, his movements gentle and efficient. For 2 days and 2 nights, he was a guardian, a nurse, a jailer, keeping his former master alive in a world that wanted them both dead. While Alistair lay helpless, lost in the labyrinth of his fever, Elias was plunged into a profound and silent debate with himself. This was his chance. The thought came to him unbidden, a cold, logical whisper in the back of his mind. He could walk away. Right now, he could take the map, the last of the coins, and simply disappear into the north. He could leave Alistair to his fate, to the fever or the wolves or the bounty hunters that were surely scouring the countryside. No one would ever know. He would be truly, completely free, unburdened by the ghost of his past, unburdened by the man who was a living embodiment of that past. He looked down at the shivering, pathetic figure on the ground. He weighed his lifetime of hatred for the system Alistair had represented, the casual cruelty, the stolen lives, the endless, grinding servitude, against the helpless, feverish man who muttered about debts and ghosts. He remembered the feel of the whip, the ache in his back, the constant simmering rage he had learned to bury so deep it had become a part of his soul. Leaving this man to die felt like a form of justice, a balancing of the scales. But then he remembered the chapel, the shared terror in Alistair's eyes, the desperate, whispered words, "For both of us." He remembered the sight of the fine wool coat being laid on the altar, a surrender of a life, not just a piece of clothing. He remembered the confession by the fire, the raw, pathetic honesty in Alistair's voice as he spoke of being a piece of property, the shocking, momentary bridge of understanding that had been built between them over a chasm of history. He had made a pact. It was a pact born of desperation, not friendship, but it was a pact nonetheless, his honor, a thing the world had tried to strip from him since the day he was born, demanded he see it through. To leave Alistair to die now would be a kind of murder. It would be an act of the same cold, calculating cruelty that had taken his own father. It would make him no better than the men he despised. He was not just a runaway slave. He was Elias, son of a free man, a man of his word. He looked at the pale, sweating face of his former master, and the debate was over. He had chosen to protect him. He reached out and placed a cool, damp cloth on Alistair's forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. The choice had been made, and with it, he had bound himself to this man not by law or by force, but by his own will. On the third day, the fever broke. Alistair woke to the sensation of cool water on his lips, his mind clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He was weak, his body aching with a profound weariness, but he was alive. He saw Elias sitting a few feet away, his back against a tree, his eyes closed but his posture alert. They had lost precious time, and their sanctuary, which had felt so remote, now seemed dangerously exposed. Their journey was stalled, increasing their risk of capture with every passing hour. They found a new hiding spot, a dilapidated trapper's cabin that was slowly being reclaimed by the forest. It was a miserable, rotting structure, but it had 4 walls and a roof that mostly kept the rain out. It was a brief, welcome respite from the elements. It was there, on their second day in the cabin, that the new threat arrived. It was not the sound of hounds this time, but the sound of human voices, rough and careless, and the jingle of harnesses. Elias, who had been outside gathering firewood, slipped back into the cabin, his face grim. He peered through a crack in the rotting wall. 2 men on horseback were moving slowly through the trees, their eyes scanning the ground. They were not lawmen. They were dressed in mismatched, trail-worn clothes, with pistols stuck in their belts and rifles resting across their saddles. They had the hard, hungry look of vultures, bounty hunters, drawn to the area by the promise of a reward. A large reward was now being offered for Elias, dead or alive, and for any information leading to the recovery of the supposedly stolen Finch fortune. "See anything?" one of the men asked, his voice a low growl. "Nothing but deer tracks," the other replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "This is a waste of time. He's probably halfway to Pennsylvania by now. The reward's $500 for the slave," the first man said. and maybe 1,000 more from that rich fiancée of his if we find the master's body. For that kind of money, I'll check every damn hollow in this state." Elias's blood ran cold. Alistair was inside, lying on a pile of old furs, still too weak to even stand, let alone run. They were trapped. The bounty hunters were moving closer, their path leading them directly towards the overgrown clearing where the cabin stood hidden. Elias's mind raced. He looked at Alistair, pale and helpless, and then back through the crack in the wall. There was no escape. He had to think fast. An idea sparked, a memory of his father, a lesson from a childhood that felt a lifetime away. It was a desperate, wild chance, but it was the only one he had. He slipped out the back of the cabin, where a section of the wall had crumbled away, leaving a small opening. He moved like a phantom, his bare feet making no sound on the damp earth. He circled around, keeping the cabin between him and the bounty hunters, his movements swift and silent. He moved through the trees, getting ahead of them, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He crouched behind a thick, ancient oak tree, about 50 yards to the left of the path the men were on. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs, and then he let it out. Not as a breath, but as a sound. It was a sound he had learned to mimic as a boy, a sound his father had taught him to identify and respect. It was a terrifying, guttural scream, the sound of a panther, a high-pitched, chilling cry that ripped through the quiet woods. It was a sound of primal violence, of a predator on the hunt. He didn't wait for a reaction. The moment the scream left his lips, he crashed through the undergrowth, deliberately making as much noise as possible, running in the opposite direction of the cabin. He snapped branches, kicked up leaves. A one-man stampede of manufactured panic. The effect on the bounty hunters was instantaneous. Their horses shied violently, their eyes rolling in terror. The men cursed, fighting to control their mounts. What in God's name was that? One of them yelled, his hand flying to the pistol at his belt. "Panther!" the other shouted, his face pale. A big one, by the sound of it. They had come hunting a man, a creature they understood. They were not prepared to be hunted by a beast they could not see. The sounds of Elias's crashing retreat continued, drawing their attention away from the cabin, towards the new, more immediate danger. "Forget the slave," the first man said, his voice tight with fear. "I ain't getting mauled for $500. He spurred his horse, turning it to follow the sound of the panther, his rifle now raised and ready. His partner, after a moment's hesitation, followed suit. The ruse had worked. Their greed had been eclipsed by their fear. Elias watched them go, his own heart pounding with the audacity of what he had just done. He waited until the sound of their horses had faded completely. Then he slowly, cautiously, circled back to the cabin. He slipped back inside, his body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. Alistair was sitting up, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He had heard the scream, had heard the men's panicked retreat. He looked at Elias, at the man who had just saved his life with nothing but his wits and the ghost of his father's voice, the quiet intimacy of the sickbed, the irony of the former slave nursing his master, had been replaced by the high-stakes tension of the hunt. Elias had proven his choice was not one of passive caretaking, but of active, dangerous protection. He had solidified his role as the guardian, and in doing so, had bound their fates together more tightly than ever before. Weeks bled into a month, and the raw, primal landscape of the swamp slowly yielded to the rolling hills and sparse farmlands that marked the borderlands of a free state. They traveled now with a new kind of caution, the fear of the wild replaced by the fear of civilization. Every distant dog bark, every curl of smoke from a chimney, was a potential threat. Alistair, gaunt and hollowed out by his fever, had regained his strength, but the journey had irrevocably changed him. The arrogance of the master had been scoured away, replaced by a quiet, watchful humility. He followed Elias's lead without question, his trust absolute, forged in the crucible of fever and fear. Their journey together was nearing its end, a fact that hung between them, unspoken but as tangible as the cool morning air. They arrived at the edge of a town as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale rose and gold. It was a small, bustling river port, a place of transition, its air thick with the smells of coal smoke, damp earth, and the promise of passage. The sounds were a chaotic symphony, the deep whistle of a riverboat, the shouts of men loading cargo, the rattle of carts on cobblestone streets, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. They stood in the deep shadows of a warehouse, two ragged, filthy figures on the edge of a world they had fought so hard to reach. This was it, the end of the path. Alistair looked at the busy port, at the faces of the free men, black and white, moving with a purpose and energy he had never witnessed. It was a world that had no place for Alistair Finch, the plantation owner. He turned to Elias, his face a mess of conflicting emotions, gratitude, shame, and a profound, aching sadness. He reached into the tattered remains of his waistcoat and pulled out the last of their shared resources. It was a small, worn leather pouch, now considerably lighter, and a folded piece of paper, carefully wrapped in oilskin to protect it from the damp. He pressed them into Elias's hand. The paper was a letter of manumission, carefully forged by Alistair months ago in his study, a document declaring Elias Turner a free man, granted his liberty by a master who no longer existed. "My name is dead," Alistair said, his voice low and raspy, barely audible over the sounds of the port. "Finch is a ghost buried in a Carolina swamp. You gave me that." He looked at Elias, his eyes, once so full of desperate fear, now holding a clear, sober light. "I can never repay you for my life." Elias looked down at the paper in his hand, at the elegant, looping script that declared him free. He felt the weight of the few remaining coins in the pouch. He then looked up, his gaze meeting Alistair's directly, their eyes locking as equals for the first and last time. The lifetime of master and slave, of power and submission, fell away in that final silent acknowledgement. "You didn't give me freedom," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm, each word honed to a fine, sharp point. "I took it." He paused, letting the truth of the statement settle between them. You opened the door. There was no handshake, no embrace. The history between them was a chasm, too vast and complex to be bridged by such a simple gesture. There was only a single solemn nod of mutual acknowledgement. They had survived. They had kept their pact, and that was enough. The debt was paid, the bargain fulfilled. Alistair Finch, or the man who had once been Alistair Finch, pulled the brim of his worn, shapeless hat down, shadowing his face. He gave Elias one last fleeting look, a look of profound, unspoken farewell. And then he turned. He stepped out of the shadows and into the bustling life of the port, a ghost melting into a crowd of the living. He walked with a slight limp, his shoulders hunched. Just another anonymous, down, on, his luck traveler looking for a new start. Elias watched him go, watched him buy a ticket from a man in a small wooden booth, watched him walk up the gangplank of a large smoke-belching riverboat bound for the west. The boat's massive paddle wheel began to churn, and with a deep, resonant blast of its whistle, it pulled away from the dock, heading upriver into the vast, unknown heart of the continent. Alistair, now calling himself Mr. Blackwood, stood at the railing, a solitary figure who did not look back. He was disappearing into a new, anonymous life, his past erased, his future a blank, unwritten page. When the riverboat was just a dark speck in the distance, Elias turned and walked away from the river. He walked north. The sun was higher now, a brilliant, warm presence that washed over him, chasing away the last of the night's chill. He walked through the busy streets of the town, a free man among free men, his head held high. He was still barefoot. His clothes were still rags, but he moved with a steady, determined pace, a man who knew his direction. The camera of our story focuses on his back, on the strong, bare shoulders that had carried the weight of his master's world and then the weight of the man himself. They were not a sign of lack, of a missing shirt or a lowly status. They were a symbol of his unburdening. He was no longer carrying a master, literally or figuratively. He was carrying only himself, his memories, and the silent, heavy price of his freedom. He walked out of the town and onto a long, dusty road that stretched north, a road that led towards a future he would build with his own two hands, a future that was his and his alone. He did not look back. He was not running from something anymore. He was walking towards everything. Years passed. The seasons turned in South Carolina, the oppressive heat of summer giving way to the mild, damp winters. The story of the disappeared master and his runaway slave slowly faded from headlines and official reports, sinking into the deeper, richer soil of local memory. The Finch plantation, unable to sustain itself under its mountain of debt, was broken up and sold off to strangers. The grand house fell into disrepair, its white columns peeling, its windows dark and empty. Eleanora Vance, after a brief and theatrical period of mourning that convinced no one, married a Charleston banker even wealthier than her father, and never spoke the name Alistair Finch again. Jedediah, the overseer, consumed by his own rage and a bottomless bottle of whiskey, met his end in a drunken brawl over a card game, a violent, ignominious death that was a fitting postscript to his brutal life. The little chapel on the edge of the property, the place where the pact had been sealed, was abandoned. Its roof sagged, its door rotted from its hinges, and thick green ivy crept up its walls, slowly pulling it back into the earth. But the story did not die. It changed. It became a legend, a ghost story whispered by children on dark nights and recounted by old men on tavern porches. The complicated, messy truth of two desperate men, one escaping a financial prison and the other a physical one, was too strange, too unsettling to be remembered as it was. So, it was polished and shaped by the telling, smoothed into a more palatable and haunting narrative. On dark, misty nights, people said, when the moon was hidden and the air was heavy with the scent of the swamp, you could still see two figures walking the old ruined property. One was a ghostly gentleman in a fine linen shirt, his face pale with sorrow, forever holding a lantern that cast no light, eternally searching for the life and the fortune he had lost. The other was a bare-shouldered spectre, a powerful shadowy figure who walked beside him, a slave forever bound to his master, forever walking towards a freedom he could never quite reach in life. The legend held a tragic romantic appeal that the truth never could. It was a story of murder and betrayal, of ghosts and lost treasure, a story that reinforced the old order rather than challenging it. The final narration of our story reflects on this transformation, on how the raw, terrifying reality of their shared journey, the fear, the pain, the sickness, the fragile trust, and the ultimate survival, was lost to time. It was all buried under the more comfortable, more chilling, and more enduring legend. The reality of a master who found his own form of slavery in his privilege, and a slave who possessed a freedom of spirit that could not be chained, was a truth too complex for the simple stories people told themselves. The world remembered a ghost story, but the truth was a story of escape. The final image is not of the two phantoms walking the ruined plantation. The final shot is of Elias, years and miles away from that place, walking into the brilliant, cleansing light of a northern sunrise, his shoulders unburdened, his pace steady, his face turned towards the horizon. A free man,